Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will be covering how to get back into strength and conditioning training after taking time off. First and foremost, we need to put this time frame into context. When referring to time off, we essentially mean that the athlete has not performed any strength and conditioning training which is directly aimed at enhancing performance for a particular sport. During this period, athletes may be performing other forms of physical activity that aren't related to their sport at all, so the athlete will still likely be active in some capacity, although it is not specific for their sport. The first factor we need to consider when returning to specialized strength and conditioning training is the injury risk of the athlete. When returning to training after time off, the athlete is more susceptible to injuries for two primary reasons. The first reason is that the training methods that will be introduced will be novel to the athlete. This is because they haven't performed this type of training for a significant period of time, meaning that their body is unaccustomed to such a stress. Therefore, the athletes aren't adapted to handle these training methods, and the tissues aren't ready to handle intense workloads. The second reason is due to the acute to chronic workload ratio. This ratio basically compares the workloads of the previous 4 weeks of training to the current week of training. If we introduce high workloads too suddenly, then our risk of injury is elevated. So if we haven't done any serious strength and conditioning training for a month or even longer, then we need to only start with low workloads to minimize injury risk. Therefore, training should be low in volume and gradually build up the volume over several weeks. The next factor we need to consider when returning to training is how each quality should be trained. At this point, the athlete will not be in very good physical condition as they will have detrained from taking time off. Therefore, it makes sense to introduce more general qualities to establish a solid baseline foundation. This will potentiate the more specific training methods that will be performed later in the year, when the athlete needs to be in peak condition. Let's now cover how each quality can be introduced back into a formal strength and conditioning training program. Speed training should initially use shorter distances. This will limit the sprint speed the athlete can reach, which is necessary for two reasons. The first is because high-speed sprinting will put the athlete at a significant injury risk, as they haven't been exposed to the stress of maximum velocity running for a long period of time. The second reason is to focus more on acceleration sprinting to build baseline force production qualities. Resisted sprint training should initially use heavier loads with shorter distances. This will again limit sprint speed to reduce injury risk. The heavier loads will also allow athletes to build sprint-specific strength, which can potentiate sprint speed later in the year. Plyometric training should initially use exercises with longer ground contact times. This will involve a slower stretch shortening cycle, making force requirements higher and contraction velocity slower. This will help to build baseline force production qualities to potentiate fast velocity plyometrics. Power training should initially use heavier loads with slower velocity. This will emphasize force production and limit contraction speeds. Strength training should initially use higher rep ranges with lighter loads. This will emphasize structural adaptations like muscle growth to build a foundation of muscle mass. This will then allow the athlete to be stronger when heavier loads are performed later in the year. And endurance training should initially use slower aerobic training. This will establish basic aerobic capacity, which will enhance more specific endurance training that will be performed later in the training year. Let's now create a program to show a practical example of how training may look at this point in time. Let's use an athlete training 4 times per week with 2 field sessions and 2 gym sessions. Starting with speed training, we can see here that the distances used are only around 10 to 15 meters. The volume starts low and gradually increases each week to reduce injury risk. Resisted sprints use short distances once again, and loads used are heavy, which is relative to the athlete's strength. The volume starts low and gradually increases over time once again. Plyometric training uses broad jumps, as this exercise involves longer contact times. On day 3, a weight vest is also used to further reduce contact times and increase force production. Endurance training uses continuous running to build an aerobic foundation. As we can see here, the duration of running increases each week to gradually build volume. For the gym sessions, power training uses the trap bar jump with heavy loads. The box squat has been implemented as a primary strength lift with higher rep ranges of around 6 to 10. And finally, some general strength exercises have also been implemented with higher rep ranges and the volume increases over time. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.